Welcome to The Threat Show, powered by Fletch.
But what happens when, in the future, you're dealing with the security of AI algorithms? Are you prepared to understand the behavior of an AI algorithm that is perhaps building malware for somebody else?
Hi, welcome to The Threat Show, powered by Fletch. I'm Darian Kinlan, VP of Technology, and joining me, as always, each week, every week, is Chris Wilder, Research Director at Tag Cyber. Hey, welcome back, Chris.
Hey, Darian. Awesome to see you as always.
Likewise. Well, we're joined this week also by a special guest, Dave Neuman. Dave has had an expansive and impactful career serving in security, operations, and technology leadership roles, preceded by 28 years of service in the United States Air Force. Wow. He worked in a variety of roles for the Air Force, including serving as commander of the 92nd Information Operations Squadron, where he pioneered the Air Force's first cyber capability to identify, characterize, and eradicate advanced persistent threats that targeted critical Department of Defense IT systems. He then went on to become VP and CISO of Rackspace, an industry-leading multi-cloud solutions provider, and then served as global CISO at iHeartMedia, one of the largest audio companies in the world. Next, he was VP of Security for the global supply chain at Dell Technologies, but now Dave works alongside Chris at Tag Cyber, in addition to being an adjunct professor at the University of Texas at San Antonio and being a member of the board of advisors at Sightgain, a breach attack simulation company. Wow. Welcome to the show, Dave.
Great to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Awesome. Pleasure. So we'll be talking with Dave a little bit more about his experience and advice for smaller cybersecurity teams shortly. But first, let's run through this week's threat landscape and trending threats. And what do we have in store for this week? Well, let's see. We were kind of talking, I think, last week, Chris, about what we were thinking, how the end of the quarter would shape up. And it seems like this week's been a little bit of a reprieve. We had over 223 roughly last week.
Yeah.
Now we're down about 5. I guess there's a little bit of a silver lining in there. What are your thoughts?
I don't know. I would never call it a silver lining. I would just say, I think the word you used, reprieve, is pretty apropos. It's going to go up and down. It's not as volatile as the stock market, but it'll still remain consistent. And I think we'll probably see an uptick as we start going into the summer months.
Yeah. And, if we dig into this a little bit more, it looks like the amount of major threats that were previously tracked seem to have gone inactive, meaning we haven't seen anything in the past 30 days. Around 15 of those seem to kind of fall off the radar. But that said, we did see an uptick of the number of threats actually going mainstream, right? From 8 to trending 4 to mainstream, total of 10. And that basically means 4 or more media outlets have started covering these particular topics. So while the total might be lower, it certainly is pretty active this week comparatively.
Well, I think we're also seeing kind of some of the threats are being more platforms or platform or attack vector specific. So you're seeing a lot of folks exploiting initial attacks, initial breaches, and they're just going from there. I mean, we'll talk about Fortinet. I mean, Fortinet. This is like the fourth week in a row that we've been talking about Fortinet, and it's a different mechanism, but the same systems that they're going after. So I think there's a little bit of a feeding frenzy going on, and they're starting to just push these attacks into the chute to get them out the door. And so I think that's part of why we're seeing a decrease in the inactive ones, and then an increase on the emerging and then the mainstream attacks.
Yeah. So let's dig into a little bit of these in more detail. So in terms of interesting threats for the past week, we have a handful of new vulnerabilities being discovered, a new malware family that was kind of found, as well as a threat group that seems to be on the rise. If we look further, right, when we talk about just the first remote code execution vulnerability discovered, it was actually found by a security researcher, specifically related to Microsoft Word, where simply delivering a weaponized RTF file in an email attachment could compromise the victim without them having to do anything other than opening up the file. Low complexity, big impact, not great. I think even the details of the proof of concept were small enough to fit in a tweet,
Yeah.
which likely means we're probably going to see this weaponized pretty soon thereafter. If you're an organization that takes a while, waits for Patch Tuesday before rolling out anything related to Microsoft patches, you might want to do things earlier. But if you can't, you might want to consider just blocking RTF files altogether in the meantime. I know that's really difficult for a lot of organizations, but this seems to be pretty serious. I'm curious your thoughts here, Chris.
Yeah, I think Microsoft will come after this one pretty quick. To be honest, every time I open up Office, or open up Word, I kind of think it's malware, anyways. But that's just me. No, I think that this is kind of par for the course right now, and you're right. It will be weaponized very quickly, and hopefully Microsoft, they're on a really, really good cadence, and they're getting the patches out quickly, and hopefully organizations heed that warning, and they really start making sure that, especially their Office 365 and their other Office environments, that those are the first things patched, because those are that's the window into the world for most organizations, that and the browser. So kind of get cyber hygiene is so important right now, and I think Microsoft will respond in kind. So I'm not too worried about this one.
Yeah, I mean, thankfully it wasn't found in the wild, but that's not necessarily an indication of it won't ever be found in the wild.
Yeah.
Speaking of that, you mentioned Fortinet earlier, Chris. So it turns out that Fortinet, I think, is on their fourth wave of new vulnerabilities discovered within their platform, 4 within the past 2 months, which is pretty amazing. Thankfully, this particular set of vulnerabilities was discovered internally using internal code audits, which is great. That's a nice benefit. But we kind of forecasted, hey, where there's one particular vulnerability, there's likely going to be more as people start uncovering, all of the different bugs and issues related to this platform. Still pretty serious. So again, if you're using Fortinet gear for any sort of network perimeter protections, you definitely want to keep them up to date, because an attacker can load any sort of executables on those devices without any sort of authentication needed. When we talk about weaponizing vulnerabilities, the last time a proof of concept, I think in the third wave of those vulnerabilities related to Fortinet, was released, it took attackers maybe about 4 days before they started seeing applications of those vulnerabilities used in the wild, which is not that slow, honestly.
No, this is just pretty typical. I mean, Dave and I talk a lot about this at TAG. You look at the various attacks and the various CVEs that pop up, they tend to come in waves. So you have your initial attack, and then it wanes, and then all of a sudden the next one comes up. And so, you saw that with Stuxnet. It's been 13 years, and now we're seeing Stuxnet version 2.0 on critical infrastructure. This is very much akin to that. It's a much shorter time cycle, but once you find that one initial vulnerability, there's more, and they go find more, and they go find more, and they go find more. And unfortunately, Fortinet's the target of the week. And who would have thought that hardware would be that much of a attack vector? But it's it's keys to the kingdom stuff there. So it's definitely needs to be taken seriously. But and I don't think Fortinet's doing a great job of responding to this, because they just have never had to.
Right.
So but the kind of trial by fire.
I agree with Chris. I think we're going to continue to see an increase on exploitation on this kind of capability, right? To his point, that these are the very locks that you use in your environment to protect it. So, but then when you look at it in combination with the other vulnerabilities and exploits that you're discussing, it makes it a really, really difficult kind of risk-based analysis when you're going through these things. So if you're a customer of these platforms, then your expectation needs to be that you're going to have these things, and do you have the internal way to really respond and remediate them in a time and space that's less than the adversary, to get to that 4-day window that you're talking about.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's growing pains for a very popular security products company. Unfortunately, growing pains in this manner are public, and it's tough as a customer. But I think every major product out there, when it reaches a certain amount of popularity, usage, they're bound to become a target in this manner.
I mean, there's a lot of things that SecOps teams and security teams and IT teams, for that matter, too, that they can, just, it's going to be hard to keep the bad actors out because they're going to come through a firewall. Most attacks come through a misconfigured firewall, anyways, and it's what you do once they're inside is really the value. So it's really good network architecture, microsegmentation, those types of things are so important that you can't keep them out, but you can at least control what they do once they're inside. And this is just something, this is something Fortinet's this is a fire that they've got to carry the burden of for right now, but it'll get better. And I think, but I think on the back end of it, with good planning and good network architecture, it's, you could alleviate a lot of the pain.
Makes sense. So moving on to our next vulnerability, really focused on software supply chains. So if you use or author any sort of software as part of your core business, you probably have something like a continuous integration, continuous deployment system, also known as CI/CD, right? And Jenkins is by far one of the most popular platforms to kind of facilitate that in terms of a build system. Unfortunately, though, there's new sets of vulnerabilities discovered within Jenkins, but it doesn't require the Jenkins server to directly be exposed to the internet. In fact, Aqua Nautilus researchers provided a pretty handy-dandy diagram which shows how an attacker basically publishes a malicious plugin to the Jenkins infrastructure. And then when you go and update your Jenkins plugin repositories, that causes the Jenkins server to get compromised, in which case now the Jenkins server is able to talk out to the attacker's infrastructure. Pretty bad. If you don't maintain and you don't patch Jenkins regularly, you might want to consider just cordoning off Jenkins from talking anywhere outside of your infrastructure at all, even to the current Jenkins infrastructure provided by the vendor's cloud, just as a means of mitigating this issue, because it's pretty serious. Thankfully, though, Jenkins did patch their own infrastructure to prevent this in the future from happening. That said, is this the last of it? Who knows, right? That's kind of the big unknown at this point.
I mean, Dave, good googly moogly, how many briefings and conversations a week do we have about software supply chain and the challenges? Like, I just did a webinar on Circle CI and how bad that turned out to be. But just these threats in the CI/CD are so rampant. We probably have 4 or 5 a week at least.
Yeah, and the broader implication here is more around code resiliency and security itself, right? Not just the pipelines that are producing this code, but that whole thing in itself. And then you combine it into the number of products. And if we just take the technology industry in its own, the laptop or desktop that most of your listeners are using here today, think of how much hardware, software, and the diversity of the suppliers is in that. Now think about how much the producer of that particular technology owns. It's probably less than 40% from a thing. So if you're running a Microsoft operating system and their apps, there you go. If you got a NVIDIA component inside that, they make a bucket of software and so on and so forth. That's before you get to some of on the application side where you may be using an extensive number of SaaS applications. So it's just exponentially increasing the threat surface. But I think that we need to continue to drive toward greater code and resiliency. And quite frankly, there are some organizational cultural things that will drive these teams together in order to deliver some of those things, because we can't continue to play whack-a-mole. There's no effective way to do it when you're talking about potentially dozens, if not hundreds of companies that are involved in making code that go into products and platforms.
Our advice to pretty much every enterprise and every DevOps organization we talk to is shift left. They have to put security up front when they're even planning what they want to do, as opposed to as an afterthought, which would alleviate a lot of these challenges. And they're not, these are hard problems to solve, but if you want to build code resiliency, you have to have consideration up front as opposed to halfway through, afterwards or whatever. And yeah, I 100% agree with you, Dave. But we share this pain. We share this burden.
It's a stupid example, but one of my favorite plays in high school was purple motion left, shift right, or blast right. And so this idea of shifting left, absolutely something we have to do, but we need to be able to play on the right side. We need to really have a dynamic and integrated presence right where code is at the time and where it's being exploited to make sure that we do both of those things. So yes, shift left, blast right, because you eliminate a lot of that by doing that shift left. And I think you grow skills and muscle memory and better team integration by doing those things, but it's by no means the total panacea, and we need to be able to blast on the right as well.
Yeah.
It's a shameless plug, by the way, that I played football in high school and I was really no good at it, and why I'm talking to you guys about cyber stuff today. So
I thought the Statue of Liberty play was yours. So.
Yeah, well, so we've covered a number of different vulnerabilities. Let's shift the focus to malware, and specifically for our next interesting threat, it's actually malware discovered in small home office routers. Is this still a thing? Apparently it is. Lumen security researchers discovered that a number of different organizations had end-of-life Draytech Vigor, I think VPN concentrators or routers that actually had laced malware, custom malware on it, in fact, that would allow an attacker to basically wholesale dump and extract any unencrypted traffic on the wire. So why is this a thing, right? We're now 2023. You'd think that most organizations would be using encrypted TLS comms for everything as far as their business. But apparently it's still a target for those organizations that haven't adopted this, SSL or TLS everywhere model, because the malware itself was configured to basically start pulling out information like mail or file sharing activity. Again, all unencrypted, right? But it's possible that in a future version of this malware, they might actually do TLS man-in-the-middle inspection, in which case now suddenly encrypted traffic is also potentially at risk. In terms of targeting, we're talking like maybe 2,000, 3,000 organizations where this was discovered. It seems like the threat group behind this kind of wants to remain low-key, but the other thing is, for many organizations that don't bother updating or securing or patching their small home office equipment, this represents a pretty significant risk to their organization. So in terms of, obviously not using end-of-life equipment, that's certainly one mitigation. Making sure all of the comms is, TLS encrypted, that's another one. But 2023, it's still happening, right? It clearly, the attackers have gotten value out of this deployment and this strategy even now, which suggests that many organizations haven't even thought about, protecting their back office systems in this way. Curious your thoughts here, Chris.
Just take my little town of 600 people here in Texas. We have a little municipal office building where, our city council works and things like that. And when I accidentally became mayor out here many years ago, the first thing I did was go in and change out all the hardware because it was incredibly old, and the mantra was, if it's not broken, don't fix it. And I think a lot of small branch offices and small offices carry that same mentality. The number one attack vector for DDoS attacks are Netgear home routers. So if you ever run a Wireshark on your home and you have a Netgear router, you're going to see DDoS over and over and over again. For really no other reason, just slow down your internet. But these are easy targets. There's a lot of these older routers out there that aren't updated. They need to be updated. They need to be changed out. Like I said, in Texas, if it ain't broken, don't fix it. That's kind of where we're at with this. But this just goes back to cyber hygiene.
Exactly.
We're hanging a lot of important stuff off of these things now. Maybe it's your home solar system. Maybe it's your electric vehicle. Yeah. This is all software moving, and there's other critical that maybe it's medical gear that is life-sustaining, that's in your home for somebody that needs that kind of stuff. So, and the problem is that most of this infrastructure is not maintained on any kind of a life cycle at the edge, like what we do in an application or a particular appliance. And so God knows my parents aren't doing this, right? They just they're using a password, let alone, paying attention to the thing. Chris and I both write for the Quarterly Journal, and I wrote some articles on deepfake and I sent it to my folks, and it was like, we started to read it, but we didn't understand it. So, but that's not a dig on my parents, but this is similar, right? People just want this to be a utility. They want it to be electricity. They want it to be water. They want to turn it on and it needs to work. But unfortunately, that's not the sustainment background, lifecycle support background that it has.
That's fair. So moving on to the final threat for today. It's actually a new malware variant linked to a Chinese-based APT, which is being called Sharp Panda, targeting other Southeast Asia organizations. Now, this has been going on for many, many years. That's really not what's new about this particular type of malware. But the malware sole framework actually has some interesting capabilities once a victim is compromised. The delivery is not so very much interesting. Again, it's, weaponized Word document or RTF file, right? But once a victim's compromised by this malware, it actually waits before beaconing out to the internet. It's not automatic all the time. They call it radio silence mode, but this type of scheduled beacon or scheduled C2 traffic is not that surprising for an advanced persistent threat group's malware, although this is a very recent iteration of that. So if you expect, a compromised system to look and smell and feel and act like it's compromised all the time, keep in mind this sort of thing does exist, and it's still being used even today.
When I see these attacks coming across, and since Dave and I, our backgrounds are very similar, it's we tend to kind of take an eye towards what's going on in kind of geopolitics and what's going on in the world and with the different conflicts. And once you start seeing a lot of these malware, especially coming out of nation states, because Sharp Panda is a nation-sponsored bad actor group, it's usually either to gain intelligence or to compromise systems that could be used later. I'm still convinced we're already in World War III, but I think that cyber war is really going to start ramping up very, very quickly, especially with what's going on in Taiwan. So when I see these things picking up, it concerns me, because this one seems nebulous, but it's by far not.
Yeah, so we'll see how many other organizations elsewhere on the planet start getting impacted by similar types of threats. Yeah, it's not a matter of if, it's more a matter of when, I think, at this point. Well, cool. I think that covers all of the threats that we had for the week.
If you want to dive deeper into this week's trending threats, be sure to check out the interactive Fletch newsletter and Trending Threats app to see all the stories we talked about, peruse the threat index at your leisure, and more. Now, on to our special guest interview.
Let's kind of switch gears next and have a deeper conversation with our guest today. Hey, Dave, how are you doing?
Well, excellent. What a great rundown on what's going on in that space. And I'm absolutely sure that your listeners would really appreciate that kind of, not just the information sharing, but the richness of the content and the conversation now. So well done, guys.
Thanks. Well, I'm curious from your perspective, you're working right now as supporting, University of Texas graduates focused in cybersecurity. What makes you seem excited or nervous for the future of cybersecurity?
So first of all, I guess what I would do is step back. When I was a CISO, a lot of people used to ask me, what keeps me up at night? And
sure. Yeah.
I think there's an endless list of those things. But one of the things that was always near the top or at the top was, have I done enough to prepare my team for the fight? The fight happened tonight. Were they ready? Have I done everything to really set those conditions for them? And that's quite frankly, one of the reasons that I teach today. And it's one as a way for me to give back. But I think that helping students that are on their own journey understand some of the realistic kind of conditions that they're going to be walking into. I think we do a great job academically at teaching them the foundations. adding in this flavor of like, okay, well, this is how this works at scale, or these are some of the greatest things. Because the reality is a freshman that's starting today in some of these programs, she's probably going to face completely different threats by the time she graduates, right? And that's going to evolve that quickly. So teaching them how to be critical thinkers, analytically and asymmetrically minded, and there's naturally curious, right? To make this not just a profession, but a passion. And so I enjoy sharing that time. It gives me a lot of energy with students. I would tell you what I think they're going to walk into, and what everybody is walking into now, is this idea of weapons proliferation, right? It started with the known or acknowledged use of cyber weapons with Stuxnet. That was 13 years ago. And now what we're seeing is an ever increasing number. A shameless plug for Nicole Perlot's book, This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends, which
that was a fascinating read.
Yeah, she does an extraordinary job of talking about all the things that people probably never know about, on how these things are brokered, bought, and used, and how dangerous they are. But where we're going now is, we're giving razor blades to babies and machine guns to teenagers, because the assimilation or acquisition of these weapons is just so easy and so profitable now. So what does that mean for the security teams that we have today? For those of your listeners that either work in a SOC or in a security organization, think about functionally what you do, organizationally where you're at. And I'm not suggesting there's one model or another that brings it together. But I think if you think in terms of time, space, and force, even with the vulnerabilities that you gave today. So here's a force, a vulnerability or an exploit, was probably more of an exploit or something like that. What is the time that you take to really get that force in place, and how long in that space do you have before it becomes something that can materially damage your organization, is how we need to think. And if you think in your own operations today, where does that threat intelligence function sit, and how well are you integrated, and are you focused on the right thing? I can remember as a squadron commander, 14 years ago, dealing with this stuff, going into a mission brief, and we would be operating maybe in Southwest Asia, but I begin an intelligence brief on cyber capabilities in Bulgaria. Is that relevant? Well, it could be, right? Because we don't know the traditional boundaries that we know in other domains, but it wasn't that. It was intelligence analysts, smart people that are going what they had, not what they needed. And so I think that we need to continuously evaluate how we work together, how we organize, how we train, if we're going to stay within the decision kind of loop of these adversaries, and have the most meaningful impact for our own organizations. Does that make sense? I almost ran out of breath there with all that long-winded thing.
No, it was, I think it's great. I mean, it's funny. Attackers get their inspiration from so many different sources.
Yeah.
They don't have a, set boundary or a set focus many times. So because of that, right, you mentioned, asymmetrical nature of defending against cybersecurity threats. A lot of these operators are having to be informed across a broad spectrum of different attack vectors, methodologies, so that they can be aware of, not only how to defend against it, but how to mitigate these issues. And that's a huge problem, I think, for many organizations. It's just prioritizing, what to focus on, right? There's so much about these topics that make the news, that make a big splash. And a lot of time it's really just, how do you prioritize what matters to your organization? So from your perspective, you mentioned your time working in the military. How has that kind of influenced the type of guidance that you provide in the private sector when these organizations and operators are trying to figure out how best to prioritize, what threats to focus on?
It's not necessary. I found that the useful conversations were not at the tactical threat level, right? They were at the operational, sometimes even the strategic level.
Sure.
The unit that I took command of initially had a blue team mission. It was in the Air Force. It was well understood, it was well resourced, and it was respected. And the nature of it and the size of our organization compared to the size of the Air Force. We would go to a very large base with very well-trained people, skills that typically were not available at the base level, very sophisticated tools. And we would come in and we would do these analysis, and then we leave them a report, wish them well, and tell them, hope we see you again in 3 years. That was not beneficial to that organization. They valued it and was like, wow, look how smart these people are, and look at all the information they've gave me, but it didn't equip them certainly to remediate those things. So I think that you need to make sure that you've set conditions to be able to do that, right? Because otherwise you're just chasing millions and millions of vulnerabilities and potential exploits every year. So our shift was, what are the capabilities that are most critical to the business outcomes, or do that? And if you try to protect everything at the same level, you protect nothing. So what we were doing is we're aligning resources, skills, technical expertise, and capabilities in a way that made sense across that risk landscape. You know, an old adage from a combat tour, if somebody said, hey, I see a bad guy all the way over there with an AK-47, it was like, good to know you saw that person with a set of binoculars and they can't possibly hit us. So let's just hold that at risk for right now, because I got a bunch of other stuff that are really important that I need to think about. And so we need to take the same approach there. Are we working on the right things? Are we organized, trained, and equipped to engage on the things that are most important? And that doesn't mean at the expense of everything else. I think that what we need to do is just start thinking more asymmetrically. And that's across things that we do very at scale today. Vulnerability management. How do we do that today? Can we move towards more immutability and reduce that level of effort so that we can focus on those? And so we don't spend enough time in our industry, and I'm sorry if that offends people, but I am part of the community and I feel like I earned that right. But we don't think asymmetrically enough. We've built 2-mile freight trains that are going 5 miles an hour. And I think it's time for us to let's take a breath and say, is it time to change some things? And I know that's very broad and ambiguous, but that's because you guys have such a wide audience here. I want to make sure that everybody takes it for something that is meaningful for them, and kind of put it through their own calculator and join us on the conversation in future broadcasts.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, we talk so much about how attackers come from everywhere, right? All walks of life. You know, it's the idea of supporting diversity of thought, of mind, of ideas, of diversity of strategies, ultimately, to better creatively defend against these threats. Assuming that the same model of how we defended threats, 5-10 years ago is still going to work today, needs to be challenged regularly. So from your perspective, I know Chris mentioned your efforts to try to give back to the community, to inspire the community. What are efforts that you're really passionate about to help kind of inspire the next generation of defenders who, as you put it, are going to be faced with an environment that looks very different from the one that exists today?
Yeah, I try to give them a view of what I think is going to happen in the future, right? Let me teach you what's going on now. Let me teach you some of the fundamentals and the pragmatic way that we deal with these things today. But what happens when, in the future, you're dealing with the security of AI algorithms? Are you prepared to understand the behavior of an AI algorithm that is perhaps building malware for somebody else? This ties back to skill sets, right? And so if you want to be, sorry for all the military analogies, but give me an opportunity to shamelessly plug for the Air Force. If you want to be an F-22, yeah, right. Sorry, I'm sorry. If you want to be the captain of an aircraft carrier, there's a path for that. It includes a lot of education, 30 years of experience, so on and so forth. And you have all these gates that you have to get through to get to the big show. What's that path if you want to be a serious coder? For good or for bad. And, we have a lot of autodidacts out there. People have taught themselves these things very, very effectively. We need to change our model on how we're teaching our people or giving them the opportunities to learn. So, again, full circle back to your question about inspiration is like, this is what this is going to look like. Make them curious about what's happening in the future. And also, our budgets are just so tight these days. And I'm not asking for more money necessarily, for more technology, but how are you planning for some time and space to give your people to learn and experiment and do those things. And those are really, really heavy returns on investment. They also earn you, and I'm speaking to the leaders in our crowd, these earn you incredible loyalty and commitment in the jobs that they're doing and reward for them. They want to stay there. And so I think, yes, the war on talent, quite frankly, isn't something that happened during, like in the last couple of years. It's been going on for about 6 or 7 years. And so if you invest in that way, then I think that inspires people and lets them know what's happening. So I think these are very real challenges that I think our newer generation of practitioners that are coming up, they want to get dirty. They want to roll around in this stuff. But we got to set the conditions for them to be curious, to look out and anticipate some of these things. I mean, think about this for a second. I'll put a timeline on it, but time moves so fast for me these days. I'm usually incorrect. Is it 2-3 years ago, we were talking about bot attacks, right? We're not, they're not keyboard on keyboard kind of things, and so what does that look like 2 years from now, 3 years from now? Think about the freshman that's going to school or the high school student that is in a vocational program. I think also, sorry if you're a big advocate, I love teaching and I teach at the collegiate level, but why is it that an 18-year-old through a vocational program that comes out of high school, why can't we take advantage of that? Why don't you, right? I mean, Chris and I picked up, the mantle when we were 18 years old to do that. We were challenged more than probably we ever have been in our lives. Why can't we do that? And so let's push that inspiration, not at this 18 to 24-year-old, but push it back into the thing. So maybe you're feeling some of my passion come out, but you can't inspire technology. You can't inspire a computer, but you can inspire a human being. And
absolutely,
we spend a lot of time doing that.
I was just going to say, just everything Dave said, 100% agree. And I think that, now the tools are starting to evolve. And again, I promised myself I would never mention ChatGPT, but BlackFog, which is a ransomware company that focuses on helping SMEs deal with ransomware, they came out with a notice today that they're able to use ChatGPT to create malware. It's very tidy ransomware. So the tools are becoming more and more available to everybody. The democratization of the tools is getting so big. So people have this readily available. So now we have to train that next generation of warriors that can leverage those tools, but also, think like criminals. And I tell my kids, what do you do for a living, Dad? I think like a crook. And I help people that way. And it's a mindset, So Dave, I couldn't agree with you more 100%. And that's why I always love talking to you. I always, I'm so happy you were able to come on the podcast this week.
Chris was ready to stand at the position of attention and stand to sing the US song.
No, I'm standing at attention. This is my AI talking. I'm an attention background, yeah. So.
And I'm inspired by that. What if you're an old fogey like Chris and I, and you're on here? What inspires you? What drives you, right?
Okay.
And how are you sharing that with the people around you to motivate them? If I am writing an AI algorithm, things have gone horribly wrong. But the idea that this could be a really, really incredible capability, and it's accelerating so fast that it can just do so many amazing things. But it's like anything else, bad guys use cars to rob banks. Right. I don't know that they do that anymore, but you get my idea. There's lots of things out there that get used for the wrong purposes, but we need to create the opportunities for that. This is all kind of like rainbows and unicorns, maybe it sounds like. But if you're a leader listening to this, think about what inspires you, what interests you. In this weird self-licking ice cream cone, I read a lot. And so what I'm finding is I can barely keep up with my reading on evolution of artificial intelligence and what's going on there. Maybe I can use AI to do my reading and then tell me what's important. Just like a weird thing, right? It's kind of interesting. And then I bore the crap out of my wife with all this stuff because she doesn't know anything or care about any of this. So.
Yeah.
No, I mean, it's insightful. I think you mentioned a couple of different things, Dave, that really kind of resonate very closely with a lot of different people that are feeling these challenges. One is, while the threats, the tactics, the methodologies evolve over time, it's really about, inspiring creativity among defenders. to be able to think, as you mentioned, Chris, like as an attacker, as a bad guy, right? So, recognizing new technologies and saying, hey, yeah, they can be used for bad. They can also be used for good. Let's see if we can, kind of level the playing field here and promote an environment where you have a team that's willing to experiment and remain creative, right? That's a hard challenge, especially with, the asymmetry of the problem. But it's absolutely important, not just from an attrition standpoint, but just keeping people aware and cognizant of, hey, here's how the threat landscape's changing, whether you're ready for it or not. That is a problem everyone faces. And, I've seen some of the best organizations adopt a model where they try to cross-train people, right? You might be brought in to do one thing, one function, but over your career, get exposed to other areas of defense, of offense, so that you become a little bit more well-rounded, a little bit able to look around corners and see what's the next thing that's likely to be on the horizon and affect the business. It's a hard problem and a hard ask, but that's what everyone has to deal with every day.
Absolutely. And a little secret, right? All security practitioners want to be great battle buddies to our business partners, right? Like, hey, we want to go do something new, or we want to buy something. We want to be at that table that says, we're ready. Let's go do that, right? Let's be wildly successful as a team, as an organization, and you can know that I'll be ready to do that. Is that the conversation you normally have, or is your conversation a little bit different? And then on the other side, our business partners know that they need us, and they know they genuinely appreciate the importance of what we do as a community. They just don't always know how to integrate it or understand it. And so if we're using a language that isn't in their vernacular, it makes that partnership even more difficult. So I would encourage folks that are listening today and that are on their own journey, think about your communication skills and how you do that. The old adage that it's not what you know, but how you sell it is really, really important. So keep that in mind.
And one of the great ways to do that, and I'll end on this one, is cyber range training is one of the best things you could possibly do for your security teams, just because it not just puts you under stress and simulation and great stuff there, but it also helps to elevate a lot of those soft skills. Because, as a SOC analyst, I typically would never have to talk to a CFO or to talk to an executive. But in a simulation, like a cyber range training simulation, you're forced to have those conversations, and it just makes us better, because we're, I've said this 100 times, I'll say it 100 times more, we're our own worst enemies. We suck at communicating as practitioners. So we've got to get better. But I think as a leader, I think cyber range training is well worth the investment.
I'm just saying, I mean, the material on that platform is just absolutely amazing. What a great source of not only threat intelligence, but learning. I mean, if you want to learn, you'll get yourself a subscription. So
there you go. Thank you so much, gentlemen. It's been an absolute pleasure, Dave. Awesome.
Thanks for having me.
Likewise. And, before we go, we kind of have a message for our audience, to anyone who's watching or listening. If you have an interesting topic that you want to discuss, or questions about threats we've covered, or anything else cybersecurity related, send us a DM on Twitter @thethreatshow, or leave a comment on our YouTube channel. We'd love to hear from you, our audience, and we'll be happy to answer any questions we can. Additionally, if you think you could be a fit for the show as a guest yourself, DM us or click the link that says, hey, you want to be a guest, on our YouTube bio or in the description of this video. Thank you for listening, and make sure you stay tuned for next week when we cover the rest of the interesting threats. Thanks, guys.
Take care, everyone. Stay well.
Thank you for tuning into The Threat Show. If you enjoyed the show, subscribe to us on YouTube, give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, and interact with us on Twitter @thethreatshow. Also, be sure to subscribe to Fletch's interactive newsletter and Trending Threats app to go deeper into the stories we discuss and the threat index. Be sure to stay tuned to stay ahead of threats.